Hey guys, Phil here, Doctor of Physical Therapy. Today we will be talking about jumping. So how do you jump? Jumping is a very important skill that we develop as kids. We need it for sports, changing directions, producing power. It's a good skill to have and it's a good skill to know how to do. A jump is also known as a plyometric movement. What that means is you're generating force by loading up your muscles and producing a lot of power at a very short time. In physical therapy, these movements tend to come at the late stage of your rehab. So say you're dealing with an injury, we're probably not going to do a lot of jumping in the beginning of rehab because these types of movements tend to put more demand on the body and things just might be too sensitive at early stage in rehab. But late stage, when we're returning you to sport, when we are trying to get you back to soccer, playing basketball, volleyball, these are things we need to do to get you as ready as possible to return to your sport. So let's dive deeper and take a look at how to jump. Before we get to jumping, we first have to talk about landing. Because when you think about it, there's a lot of force when you leave the ground and then come back down. Your body needs to be able to handle that shock absorption. So what I like to do in rehab is to get my patients comfortable with landing before we talk about jumping and producing a lot of power. Here are some drills that I like to do before we get into jumping. Ground attack. This is what it looks like. So basically what you're doing is you're going onto your toes, standing nice and tall with your arms high up, and then you're going to quickly snap down to the ground and land. So the goal of this is to be quick and soft. So you want to land softly. When we land, we want to be fluid, right? We don't want to land with stiff knees. We don't want to land with this upright, stiff posture. It just doesn't make sense. It's not the most efficient. It's not the most comfortable in our joints. So we want to see, can you land nice and quick, soft, absorb the impact, bring your hips back, bend your knees to really absorb that impact. Give these a shot and see how you feel. This is also really good for a warm-up because it trains your brain and gets you ready for that quick land. Once you have that down, I like to do a ground attack to a single leg. So what this looks like is you're still going to start with both legs on your toes with your arms nice and high, and then you're going to quickly drop down and land on one leg this time. The goal of this is the same thing. We want to see, can you land on one leg and shock absorb efficiently without kind of losing your balance, without doing anything weird with your knees or rotating, twisting too much. We want to see, can you maintain that balance? And this is also going to be really important for returning somebody to sport. So say you're in rehab, you're trying to get back into playing your sport. You need to be able to stand on one leg and hold yourself before we talk about like jumping, cutting, and like changing directions. So these are two really good warm-up drills that I like to do before we progress you to running or jumping. But before we move on to the actual jumping part, I want to talk about knee positioning. So our knees are pretty simple joints. For the most part, the knee just bends and it straightens. That's it. When you bend it, it's called flexion. When you straighten it, it's called extension. Pretty simple. Ideally, when we're training, when we're landing, we're doing these tasks, we want to see good positioning. And what that means is I don't want to see a whole lot of rotation, side to side, twisting motions, because the knee is just not designed to do that. Yes, sometimes in sports, because it's very uncontrollable, your knee does have to go into all these crazy movements. But in training, especially after an injury, we want to train you in the most efficient position possible. Common movement that we see what people do when they're jumping or landing is called a knee valgus. What that means is your knee kind of goes in when you're landing. What we want to look at when we're training is we want the knee to follow the toes, so not a lot of inward motion. Now, let's talk more about jumping. There are two major forms of jumping. There is the hip dominant jump and the quad dominant jump. The hip dominant jump is when you're trying to jump as high as possible. So say you're going for maximum effort high jump, or you're trying to jump as far as you can. You'll probably adopt a hip dominant jump. But what that means is you're bending a lot at your hip. So you're loading up all your muscles and then you're spraying up. You're just trying to produce as much force as possible. So that is on one end of the spectrum. And then you have the quad dominant jump. The quad dominant jump is more quads. So you're using more of your thigh muscles when you're jumping. So you do this a lot more when you're doing things like jump roping, skipping, or even running is much more quad dominant than hips. Because when we're running, we're not bending a lot from our hips to run, right? We're just using our legs and quads and calves mostly to just kind of quickly spring. So this form of jumping is going to be quicker, but it's also not going to be as powerful. Because if you think about your body as a spring, you're not loading that spring. Because in the hip dominant strategy, you're loading that spring a lot and then you're launching. But in the quad dominant, in this case, you're just kind of doing a soft bend at the knees and then you're just jumping out of that. Say you're playing basketball and you're trying to get a rebound. Sometimes you might not have time to kind of load into your hips and jump. Sometimes you just have to quickly react and jump as fast as possible. So chances are you'll use a more quad dominant strategy to jump. The same thing when you're landing, ideally you want to land with both feet, knees follow your toes, nice and soft. Now we can talk about the progression of jumping. So first there's jumping in place. This is exactly what it sounds like. You're just going to jump in place. Ideally starting with both legs. You can play around with hip or knee dominant depending on what you're trying to train. The hip dominant one is going to look slower. You're just trying to jump high. The knee dominant one is going to be quicker. You're trying to train your thighs, train your quads to generate that force. Next, you have jumping forwards or backwards. So remember, same idea. We have two versions. We have a more hip dominant one versus a more quad dominant one, depending on what you're trying to train. A quick side about landing. Ideally, when we're landing, we want to go from toe to heel. If you think about it, when you're landing, you don't want to land right on your heel. There's not going to be a lot of shock absorption there. So we really want to land toe to heel to absorb. Next, you can play around with some side to side hops. The idea is the body is really good at going this way. When you add in some side to side motion in this plane, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. Same thing, you have a hip dominant version and a quad dominant version. And if you mastered all of these jumps, then we can talk about jumping higher onto a step or a box. That way you're really generating some force and seeing how high you can go. And if all that feels pretty good, we can start introducing some single leg hopping. So single leg is just going to make everything harder. So we're going to go back to jumping in place. So jumping in place with a hip dominant strategy, jumping in place with a knee dominant strategy. So next we can do some forward and backward jumping, and then adding in some side to side jumping. And remember, especially if we're recovering from injury, we want to be good about landing. We want to be good about shock absorption. And once you master those, then you can jump onto a box or onto a step with one leg, and that's just going to be that much harder. So there you go, that's how you jump. So go out there and try some jumping, see how things feel. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. If you like this video, you can like it. And if you want to subscribe for more content like this, you can do that too. Cheers.